My daughter Cassie looked me straight in the eye and said the words that shattered everything I thought I knew about motherhood. "Honestly, Mom, we'd all be better off if you were just dead already." The silence that followed was deafening. My son Marcus nodded in agreement, his arms crossed, while my youngest, Tyler, just stared at his phone like I wasn't even there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. These were the children I had sacrificed everything for, the same kids I had worked 3 jobs to support, who I had put through college while I ate ramen noodles for dinner. And here they were, standing in my living room, telling me I should die. But what they didn't know was that their cruel words would lead to the biggest mistake of their lives. Because the next morning, I made a phone call that would strip away everything they thought they were entitled to, everything they believed was theirs. And when they realized what I had done, when they saw their comfortable lives crumbling around them, they would understand exactly what it meant to lose the one person who had been holding their world together. My name is Lorene Butler, and I'm 62 years old. For most of my life, I believed that being a good mother meant putting your children first, no matter what. I thought that love meant sacrifice, that family meant loyalty, and that blood was thicker than water. I was wrong about all of it. It started on a Thursday evening in November. The kind of gray, drizzly day that makes you want to stay inside with a cup of tea and a good book. I had been looking forward to our monthly family dinner for weeks. It was the one tradition we had managed to keep alive after their father died 5 years ago, the one time when all 3 of my children would come together under the same roof. I had spent the entire day preparing. I made Marcus's favorite pot roast, the same recipe I had been making since he was 10 years old. I baked Cassie's beloved chocolate chip cookies from scratch, using the recipe my mother had passed down to me. For Tyler, I prepared his favorite garlic mashed potatoes, the ones he used to beg me to make every birthday. The table was set with my grandmother's china, the same dishes I had saved for special occasions throughout their childhood. The house smelled like home, like comfort, like all the years of love I had poured into raising them. I had even bought flowers for the dining room table, bright yellow chrysanthemums that reminded me of the ones we used to pick together in the backyard when they were small. Cassie arrived first, as she always did. At 28, she was the oldest and had always taken on the role of the responsible one. She worked as a marketing manager for a tech company downtown, drove a BMW that she was constantly complaining about the payments for, and lived in a trendy loft apartment that cost more per month than I used to make in 3 months when she was growing up. She walked in without knocking, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors I had refinished myself last spring. She barely glanced at me before heading straight to the kitchen to inspect what I had prepared. "Mom, you know I'm trying to cut back on carbs," she said, lifting the lid off the mashed potatoes with a disapproving frown. "And this much butter can't be good for any of us." I swallowed the hurt that rose in my throat. "I can make you a salad if you prefer, sweetheart." "I just thought you might enjoy your old favorites." She rolled her eyes. "It's fine, I guess. I'll just have to work out extra hard tomorrow." Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, bringing with him the familiar scent of expensive cologne and barely contained irritation. At 26, he had always been my middle child in every sense of the word. Not quite as driven as Cassie, not quite as carefree as Tyler. He worked in finance, wore suits that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and had developed an attitude that made it clear he thought he was better than the modest suburban neighborhood where he grew up. "Traffic was murder," he announced, loosening his tie as he walked through the front door. "I almost didn't come. I've got an early meeting tomorrow and I really need to review some reports tonight." My heart sank a little. "I'm glad you made it. It wouldn't be the same without you." He grunted in response, already pulling out his phone to check his emails. Tyler was the last to arrive, which was typical. At 23, he was my baby, though he hated when I called him that. He had graduated from college the previous year with a degree in graphic design that he wasn't using. Instead, he was living in my basement, playing video games, and working part-time at a coffee shop while he figured things out. He shuffled upstairs from the basement, his hair uncombed, wearing the same wrinkled t-shirt he had been wearing for the past 3 days. He mumbled a greeting and immediately went to the refrigerator to grab a beer. Tyler, we're about to eat dinner, I said gently. Maybe save the beer for after? He looked at me like I had suggested he cut off his arm. It's just one beer, Mom. Relax. The word relax stung more than it should have. I had been anything but relaxed for the past month, ever since I had received the letter from the bank. The letter that had kept me awake every night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how I was going to solve a problem that seemed impossible. We sat down to dinner, and I tried to recapture the warmth of the family meals we used to share. I asked about their jobs, their friends, their plans for the holidays, but their responses were short, distracted. Cassie spent most of the meal scrolling through her phone, occasionally showing Marcus something on her screen that would make them both laugh in a way that felt exclusive, like they were sharing jokes I wasn't smart enough to understand. Tyler ate mechanically, barely looking up from his plate. When I asked him about his job search, he just shrugged and said he was working on it. The conversation felt forced, artificial. I found myself talking more than usual, trying to fill the uncomfortable silences with stories about my week, about the neighbors, about anything that might spark some interest from them. But I could see their eyes glazing over, could feel their impatience radiating across the table like heat from a fire. It was when I was serving dessert that I finally worked up the courage to bring up the real reason I had been so eager for this family dinner. My hands were shaking slightly as I set down the plates of homemade apple pie, the same dessert I had made for every special occasion throughout their childhood. There's something I need to talk to you all about, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. I received some news from the bank last month, and I wanted to discuss it with you as a family. Cassie looked up from her phone for the first time all evening, her expression immediately suspicious. What kind of news? I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Well, you know how your father and I took out a second mortgage a few years before he died, to help pay for your college expenses, and to make some improvements to the house. Marcus frowned. Yeah, so? The thing is, with the interest rates and my fixed income from Social Security, I've been struggling to keep up with the payments. The bank sent me a notice that I'm 3 months behind, and they're threatening foreclosure. The silence that followed was not the kind I had hoped for. It wasn't the silence of family members processing difficult news and preparing to rally together. It was the silence of people who were annoyed at being inconvenienced. Cassie was the first to speak. How much are we talking about here? The total amount owed is about $47,000. But to bring it current and avoid foreclosure, I would need about $8,000 immediately. Tyler let out a low whistle. $8,000? Mom, that's like a lot of money. I know it is, sweetheart. I wouldn't ask if I had any other options. I've already looked into refinancing, but with my income and my age, no bank will approve me. I've cut every...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Skins I can think of. I've been eating one meal a day for the past 2 months trying to save money. The admission hung in the air like a confession. I hadn't meant to tell them about skipping meals, but the words had slipped out before I could stop them. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression calculating. Mom, you have to understand our position here. We all have our own financial obligations. Cassie's got her car payments and her apartment. I just bought my condo and I'm paying off my student loans. Tyler's barely making minimum wage. I understand that, I said quickly. I'm not asking for charity. This house will be yours someday anyway. Think of it as an investment in your inheritance. Cassie laughed, but there was no humor in it. Our inheritance? Mom, have you looked at this place lately? The roof leaks, the foundation has cracks, the kitchen hasn't been updated since the 80s. Even if we sold it tomorrow, after paying off the mortgage and fixing everything that's broken, there might not be anything left. Her words felt like physical blows. This house wasn't just a building to me, it was the place where I had brought each of them home from the hospital. It was where they had taken their first steps, said their first words, celebrated every birthday and Christmas. It was where their father had died, where I had held his hand as he took his last breath and promised him I would take care of our children. But it's our family home, I whispered, my voice breaking slightly. Tyler spoke up for the first time since we had sat down. Mom, no offense, but it's not really our home anymore. We've all moved on. We have our own lives now. But where would I go? I asked, hating how small and desperate my voice sounded. Cassie shrugged. There are senior living communities. Assisted living places. Some of them are really nice. You might actually be happier somewhere like that, around people your own age. The suggestion felt like a slap. Assisted living. Like I was some feeble old woman who couldn't take care of herself. I was 62, not 92. I was still healthy, still independent, still capable of living on my own. I don't want to live in a facility, I said firmly. I want to stay in my home, the home where I raised you, the home your father and I built together. Marcus sighed heavily, like I was being unreasonable. Mom, you're being emotional about this. You need to think practically. Maybe losing the house would actually be a good thing. Force you to downsize, to live within your means. Live within my means? I repeated, my voice rising slightly. I worked 3 jobs to put you through college, Marcus. I cleaned offices at night and waited tables on weekends, so you could have the opportunities I never had. I lived within my means then by eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so you could have new clothes for school. That was your choice, Cassie said coldly. We never asked you to sacrifice like that. The casual cruelty of her words took my breath away. You were children. It was my job to sacrifice for you. And now it's our job to sacrifice for you, Marcus asked. That's not how life works, Mom. At some point, everyone has to take care of themselves. I looked around the table at the 3 people I loved more than life itself, searching their faces for some sign of the children I had raised. The children who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who used to beg me to read just one more story before bedtime, who used to make me handmade cards on Mother's Day telling me I was the best mom in the world. I'm not asking you to take care of me, I said quietly. I'm asking for help during a difficult time, the same way I helped you when you needed it. Cassie set down her fork with a sharp clink against the china. Mom, you need to listen to what we're telling you. We can't afford to bail you out of your financial problems. And honestly, maybe it's time you learned to be more independent. More independent? I laughed, but it came out bitter and harsh. I've been independent my entire life. I was independent when your father got sick, and I had to work extra shifts to pay for his medical bills. I was independent when he died and left me with 3 children to raise alone. I was independent when I put myself through real estate classes so I could get a better job to support us. That was different, Tyler said, not looking up from his plate. That was your responsibility. And you're not my responsibility anymore? I asked, my heart breaking with each word. Is that what you're telling me? The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Finally, Cassie spoke, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. Mom, we're adults now. We have our own lives, our own responsibilities. You can't expect us to drop everything and fix your problems every time you make a bad financial decision. A bad financial decision? I repeated incredulously. Taking out a second mortgage to pay for your education was a bad financial decision? You could have made us take out student loans like everyone else, Marcus said. Instead, you took on debt you couldn't afford. That's not our fault. I stared at him, this man who I had held as a baby, who I had rocked to sleep every night for the first year of his life. This man who I had sat up with when he had nightmares, who I had cheered for at every soccer game, who I had helped with homework every night until he graduated high school. You're right, I said quietly. It's not your fault, it's mine. It's my fault for thinking that the children I sacrificed everything for would care enough to help me when I needed it most. Cassie rolled her eyes. Here we go with the guilt trip. Mom, we're not responsible for your choices. You chose to have children. You chose to sacrifice for us. No one forced you to do any of that. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs, felt the room spin slightly around me. This was not the conversation I had imagined having. I had expected concern, maybe some gentle problem-solving, possibly even offers to help in whatever way they could. I had never expected this cold indifference, this casual dismissal of my desperation. So that's it then? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You're just gonna let me lose my home? Tyler finally looked up from his plate, his expression annoyed. Mom, you're being dramatic. It's just a house. You can find somewhere else to live. Just a house, I repeated numbly. This is just a house to you. It's 4 walls and a roof, Cassie said impatiently. You're acting like we're asking you to give up a child or something. I looked at her, this daughter I had carried for 9 months, who I had given birth to after 18 hours of labor, who I had nursed and raised and loved with every fiber of my being, and I realized that somewhere along the way I had failed completely as a mother. Because the woman sitting across from me was a stranger. You know what? I said, standing up from the table on shaky legs. You're absolutely right, it is just a house. And you're just my children. Biology doesn't guarantee anything, does it? Marcus looked uncomfortable for the first time all evening. Mom, don't be like that. We're just trying to be realistic here. Realistic, I nodded. Right. Well, let me be realistic too. If you can't help me, then I guess I'll have to figure this out on my own, like I always have. I started clearing the dishes, my hands trembling with a mixture of hurt and anger. The apple pie sat untouched on their plates, growing cold and forgotten like the love I had tried to serve along with it. Don't make this about us being bad children, Cassie said, her voice defensive now. We didn't create this problem. I stopped what I was doing and turned to face them. You're right. You didn't create this problem. But you could solve it and you're choosing not to. And that tells me everything I need to know about who you've become. What's that supposed to mean? Marcus asked. I looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces, because I had a feeling this would be the last time I saw them as my children. After tonight, they would just be 3 people who shared my DNA. It means that I spent so much time making sure you had everything you wanted that I forgot to teach you how to care about anyone other than yourselves. It means that I failed you as a mother, because I raised selfish, entitled people who think the world owes them something. Tyler scoffed. Oh, come on. You're being ridiculous. Am I? I asked. When was the last time any of you asked how I was doing? When was the last time you called just to check on me? When was the last time you visited when you didn't need something? The silence that followed was answer enough. That's what I thought, I said quietly. You know, your father used to worry that we were spoiling you too much. He said we should make you work for things, make you understand the value of money and sacrifice. But I always defended you. I always said you were good kids who would do the right thing when it mattered. I laughed, but there was no joy in it. I guess he was right and I was wrong. About a lot of things. Cassie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You know what, Mom? Maybe you're right. Maybe we are selfish. But at least we're honest about it. At least we don't use guilt and manipulation to try to get what we want. Guilt and manipulation? I repeated, my voice rising. I'm asking my children for help because I'm about to lose my home. How is that manipulation? Because you're trying to make us feel bad for having boundaries, Marcus said, standing up as well. You're trying to make us responsible for fixing your mistakes. My mistakes? I nodded slowly. Yes, I can see now that I made a lot of mistakes. The biggest one was thinking that love and sacrifice would be enough to raise decent human beings. Tyler finally looked directly at me, his face flushed with anger. You want to know what your real mistake was, Mom? Your mistake was thinking that we owe you something just because you chose to have us. We didn't ask to be born. We didn't ask you to sacrifice for us. That was your choice, and now you want us to pay you back for it. His words hung in the air like poison, spreading through the room and contaminating everything they touched. I felt something inside me break, something that I knew would never heal. You didn't ask to be born, I repeated softly. You're right, you didn't ask to be born. And if I had known then what kind of people you would become, maybe I would have made a different choice. The room went completely silent. Even Tyler looked shocked at what I had said. But I wasn't done. You want to know what I think about late at night when I can't sleep because I'm worried about losing my home? I think about all the times I went without so you could have. I think about the Christmas when I worked overtime for 2 months so I could afford to buy you the presents you wanted. And I ate soup from a can for Christmas dinner because I had spent all my money on you. My voice was getting stronger now, fueled by decades of suppressed hurt and disappointment. I think about the time Cassie needed $800 for a spring break trip in college, and I sold my grandmother's wedding ring to get it for her. I think about when Marcus wanted to go to that expensive summer program for business students, and I took out a loan against my car to pay for it. I think about Tyler living in my basement rent-free for the past year while I struggle to pay my bills. They were all staring at me now, but I couldn't tell if it was shock or anger or something else entirely. But you know what I think about most? I think about how stupid I was to believe that any of that mattered. I thought I was investing in my children, in people who would love me back, who would care about me the way I cared about them. Instead, I was just enabling 3 selfish strangers who happened to share my last name. Cassie's face was red now, her voice shaking with anger. How dare you say that to us? How dare you stand there and act like we're monsters because we won't bankrupt ourselves to fix your problems? I'm not asking you to bankrupt yourselves, I said quietly. $8,000 split 3 ways is less than $3,000 each. Cassie, you spend more than that on clothes in 6 months. Marcus, that's less than you spent on your last vacation. Tyler, that's what you could make in 2 months if you worked full-time instead of 20 hours a week. It's not about the money, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what is it about? I asked. The question hung in the air, and I watched as they exchanged glances with each other, like they were having a conversation I wasn't part of. Finally, Cassie spoke, her voice cold and deliberate. It's about the fact that you've been a burden for years, and we're tired of it. The word burden hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward, my hand reaching out to steady myself against the wall. A burden, I repeated numbly. Yes, she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. A burden. Do you think we don't notice that every conversation we have ends with you needing something? Money, help with the house, someone to drive you to appointments. Do you think we don't get tired of it? Marcus nodded in agreement. She's right, Mom. It's always something. And now this house thing is just the biggest ask yet. I looked at Tyler, waiting for him to disagree, to defend me, to show some sign that he still cared about me as more than just an inconvenience in his life. Instead, he shrugged. I mean, they're not wrong. You do call a lot asking for stuff. The betrayal was complete. All 3 of my children, the people I had loved more than my own life, were standing in my dining room telling me that I was a burden to them. I see, I said quietly. Well, I certainly wouldn't want to be a burden anymore. Something in my tone must have caught their attention, because they all looked at me more closely. What do you mean? Cassie asked suspiciously. I smiled, but I could feel that it didn't reach my eyes. I mean that you've made your position very clear. You don't want to help me, and you consider me a burden. So I'll stop being one. Mom, what are you talking about? Marcus asked, his voice uncertain now. I walked to the front door and opened it, gesturing for them to leave. I'm talking about the fact that you don't want a relationship with me unless it's convenient for you. So let's make it convenient. Let's make it non-existent. Tyler stood up slowly. You're kicking us out? I'm setting you free, I said calmly. Free from the burden of having a mother who expects anything from her children. Free from the obligation of pretending to care about someone who obviously means nothing to you. Cassie grabbed her purse, her movements sharp and angry. Fine. If that's how you want to be, then fine. But don't come crying to us when you end up in some nursing home, because you burned all your bridges. I wouldn't dream of it, I replied evenly. In fact, let me make this easier for all of you. Consider this the last time you'll ever hear from me. No more calls asking for help. No more guilt trips. No more burdens. You're free. Marcus looked like he wanted to say something, but Cassie grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. Come on, she said. Let her throw her tantrum. She'll get over it when she realizes she needs us. They walked past me and out the door, Tyler trailing behind them like a lost puppy. As they reached the end of the driveway, Cassie turned back one last time. You know what, Mom? She called out loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Honestly, We'd all be better off if you were just dead already. The words echoed in the night air, hanging there like a curse. I stood in the doorway and watched as they got into their cars and drove away, leaving me alone with the devastating truth of what my children really thought of me. I closed the door quietly and walked back into the dining room, where the remains of our family dinner sat growing cold on the table. The apple pie I had made with such love and hope sat untouched, a perfect metaphor for everything I had tried to give them over the years. I sat down heavily in my chair and looked around at the empty room. The silence was deafening, but it was different from the uncomfortable silence during dinner. This was the silence of finality, of endings, of doors closing forever. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the wall, where family photos hung in neat rows. Pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies and family vacations. All of it felt like lies now, pretty pictures that covered up the ugly truth of what my family had become. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking that maybe one of them was calling to apologize, to take back the horrible things they had said. But when I looked at the caller ID, it was just a telemarketer. I let it go to voicemail and returned to my contemplation of the ruins of my family. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my living room, wrapped in the quilt my mother had made for me when I got married, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. I thought about all the choices I had made, all the sacrifices I had endured, all the love I had poured into 3 people who had grown up to see me as nothing more than an inconvenience. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, something shifted inside me. The grief and hurt were still there, but they were joined by something else, something harder and more determined. If my children wanted to be free of me, then I would give them exactly what they wanted. But freedom, I realized, worked both ways. I got up and walked to my bedroom, to the closet where I kept my important papers. I pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years and set it on my bed. Inside were documents that my children knew nothing about, documents that would change everything once they understood what they meant. I smiled as I sorted through the papers, and for the first time since my children had walked out of my house, it was a real smile. They thought they knew everything about their mother, about what I was capable of, about what I owned and what I owed. They were about to learn how wrong they were about all of it. As the sun began to rise outside my bedroom window, I made a phone call that would set everything in motion. My children had made their choice, and now I was going to make mine. They wanted me to stop being a burden. I was about to grant their wish in ways they never could have imagined. The morning after my children destroyed what was left of my heart, I woke up on the couch still wearing the same clothes from dinner. My neck ached from sleeping at an awkward angle, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the hollow feeling in my chest. For a moment, I lay there hoping it had all been a nightmare. Then I saw the dirty dishes still sitting on the dining room table, and reality crashed over me like a wave. I forced myself to get up and start cleaning. As I scraped the untouched apple pie into the garbage disposal, Cassie's words echoed in my mind. We'd all be better off if you were just dead already. The casual cruelty of it still took my breath away. These were the children I had rocked to sleep, the ones I had sung lullabies to, the ones I had bandaged when they fell and comforted when they cried. The house felt different now, emptier somehow, as if their rejection had physically changed the space. I moved through the rooms mechanically, putting things away, wiping down surfaces, trying to restore order to a life that felt completely chaotic. But no amount of cleaning could wash away the stain of what had happened. It wasn't until I was putting away the good china that I remembered the box of papers I had pulled out in the early hours of the morning. I had been so exhausted and emotional that I had left it sitting open on my bed, the contents scattered across the quilt my mother had made. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs feeling heavier than they should have, and stood in the doorway of my bedroom looking at the documents that represented decades of careful planning. My children thought they knew everything about me. They thought I was just a poor, desperate woman with no options and no power. They had treated me like a beggar at their table, someone whose only value was in what I had already given them. But as I sat down on the edge of my bed and began organizing the papers, I felt something stirring inside me that I hadn't felt in years. It was Ty. The same feeling I'd experienced when their father died and everyone told me I should sell the house and move somewhere smaller. The same feeling I had when the school counselor suggested that maybe Tyler wasn't college material and I should lower my expectations. It was the feeling of someone who had been underestimated their entire life finally deciding to prove everyone wrong. The first document I picked up was a stock certificate dated 15 years ago. It was for a small tech company that barely existed when I had invested in it, using money I had saved from working overtime shifts at the hospital where I had been employed as a records clerk. Everyone had told me I was crazy to put my hard-earned money into something so risky, especially a single mother with 3 children to support. But I had seen something in the company's business plan, something that reminded me of the way the world was changing, becoming more connected, more digital. That investment had been worth $2,000 when I made it. The company was now called Data Flow Solutions, and it was worth just over $2 million. I had never told my children about it. At first, because it seemed too good to be true, like counting chickens before they hatched. Then, as the company grew and the investment became more valuable, I kept quiet because I wanted to surprise them someday. I had imagined telling them when they graduated from college, or when they got married, or when they had children of their own. I had pictured their faces lighting up with pride and amazement at their mother's foresight and intelligence. Now, as I held the certificate in my hands, I realized how naive I had been. They wouldn't have been proud of me. They would have been angry that I hadn't told them sooner, upset that I had kept it secret, demanding to know why I hadn't used the money to make their lives easier. They would have found a way to make my success about their suffering. The second document was even more significant. It was the deed to a small commercial property downtown that I had purchased 12 years ago. The building housed a coffee shop on the ground floor and 2 apartments upstairs, and it generated enough rental income to cover its own expenses, plus a small profit. I had bought it with money from selling my first stock investment, a different company that had done well but not nearly as well as Dataflow. Again, I had never mentioned it to my children. I had wanted it to be a surprise, a legacy, something that would provide them with income for the rest of their lives. The building was now worth approximately $400,000, and the rental income was steady and reliable. The third document was a bank statement from an account my children knew nothing about. Over the years, I had been putting small amounts of money into this account whenever I could manage it. $10 here, $50 there, the occasional windfall from a tax refund or a bonus at work. It had grown slowly but steadily, and now it contained just over $60,000. As I sat there surrounded by evidence of my secret financial life, I began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, but it grew louder and more intense until I was laughing so hard that tears streamed down my cheeks. My children thought I was a burden. They thought I was a desperate old woman begging for their charity. They had actually suggested that I move into assisted living because I couldn't afford to maintain my own home. If they only knew the truth. I could pay off the mortgage on this house tomorrow and still have enough money left over to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I could buy each of them a car, pay off their student loans, and give them the financial freedom they claimed to want so badly. But why would I do that now? After the way they had treated me, after the things they had said, why would I reward their cruelty with generosity? I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for David Chen, the financial advisor who had been managing my investments for the past 10 years. David was one of the few people who knew about my hidden assets, and he had been encouraging me for years to diversify my portfolio and maybe tell my family about my financial situation. "Lorene," he said warmly when he answered the phone. "How are you doing? I was just looking at your account yesterday." Dataflow hit another milestone. "I'm doing well, David," I lied smoothly. "Actually, I'm calling because I want to make some changes to my estate planning." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Changes? What kind of changes?" "I want to remove my children as beneficiaries," I said calmly. "All of them. I want to set up a charitable trust instead." The silence that followed was longer this time. "Lorene, that's a significant decision. Are you sure you want to do something so drastic? Maybe we should schedule a meeting to discuss this in person." "I'm very sure," I said firmly, "and I want to do it as soon as possible." "How quickly can we arrange for the paperwork to be prepared?" "Well, I suppose we could have everything ready by early next week," David said slowly. But Lorene, I really think you should take some time to consider this. Cutting your children out of your will entirely, that's not something you can easily undo if you change your mind. I won't change my mind, I said with a certainty that surprised even me. They made their position very clear. They don't want to be burdened with me while I'm alive, so why should they benefit from my death? David cleared his throat uncomfortably. Did something happen? The last time we spoke, you were excited about surprising them with your financial situation. I almost laughed again. Oh, I'm still going to surprise them. Just not in the way I originally planned. We talked for another few minutes about the logistics of changing my will and setting up the charitable trust. I decided to leave my money to organizations that helped single mothers and their children, people who actually understood the value of sacrifice and hard work. It felt fitting somehow, like my money would go to people who deserved it, instead of people who felt entitled to it. After I hung up with David, I sat in my bedroom for a long time, feeling lighter than I had in months. The foreclosure notice that had been keeping me awake at night suddenly seemed like a joke. I could pay it off with pocket change. But I didn't want to. Not yet. My children had refused to help me when they thought I was desperate and powerless. Now I wanted to see what they would do when they realized just how wrong they had been about everything. I spent the rest of the morning making phone calls. First, I called the bank and spoke to the loan officer who had sent me the foreclosure notice. I explained that I had been exploring my options and that I might be able to resolve the situation soon, but I needed a little more time. He was surprisingly accommodating, probably because most people in my situation didn't call to request extensions, they just disappeared. Then I called my neighbor, Margaret Torres, who lived 2 houses down. Margaret was close to my age and had become a good friend over the years, especially after her husband died 3 years ago. She was one of the few people who had continued to check on me regularly and who genuinely seemed to care about my well-being. "Lorene," she said when she heard my voice. "I was just thinking about you. How did the family dinner go last night? I saw all the cars in your driveway." I hesitated for a moment, not sure how much I wanted to share. But Margaret had always been a good listener, and I desperately needed someone to talk to. "It didn't go well," I said simply. "Actually, it was probably the worst evening of my life." "Oh, honey, what happened?" I found myself telling Margaret everything. About the foreclosure notice, about my request for help, about my children's cold response and their final devastating words. Margaret listened without interrupting, making small sounds of sympathy and outrage at appropriate moments. "I can't believe they said that to you," she said when I finished. "After everything you've done for them. Lorene, I've watched you raise those children. I've seen you work yourself to exhaustion for them. How could they be so cruel?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I keep trying to figure out where I went wrong, how I raised such selfish people." "You didn't do anything wrong," Margaret said firmly. "Some people are just takers, Lorene. They take and take and take, and they never give anything back. It doesn't matter how much you love them or how much you sacrifice for them. They'll always want more." Her words were comforting, but they also made me sad. Because she was talking about my children, the people I had loved more than anyone else in the world. "Margaret," I said slowly, "can I ask you something? And I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Do you think I'm a burden? Do you think I call too much or ask for too much help?" The question had been weighing on me since last night. Maybe my children were right. Maybe I had been needy and demanding without realizing it. Margaret was quiet for a moment, and I held my breath waiting for her answer. "Lorene Butler," she said finally, her voice firm and clear. "You are one of the most independent, self-sufficient people I know. In the 5 years since I've lived next door to you, you have asked me for help exactly 3 times. Once when you had the flu and needed someone to pick up groceries, once when your car wouldn't start and you needed a ride to work, and once when you were moving that heavy dresser and needed an extra pair of hands." She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. "On the other hand, do you know how many times you've helped me? You've brought me dinner when I was sick. You've shoveled my driveway when I threw out my back. You've listened to me cry about missing my husband. You've driven me to doctor's appointments when I was too nervous to go alone. You're not a burden, Lorene. You're a blessing. I felt tears starting to flow again, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief and validation. Thank you, I whispered. I needed to hear that. Your children don't deserve you, Margaret said bluntly. And I think deep down, you know that. After we hung up, I felt more confident in the decisions I was making. Margaret was right. I wasn't the problem here. I had been a good mother, a generous mother, maybe too generous. I had raised children who expected everything and appreciated nothing, and that was on them, not on me. I spent the afternoon researching the charities I wanted to include in my trust. There was an organization that provided emergency financial assistance to single mothers, another that offered college scholarships to first-generation students, and a third that helped elderly people avoid foreclosure on their homes. The irony of the last one wasn't lost on me. As I was reading about the different organizations, my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and saw that it was Tyler. For a moment, I considered not answering. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what he had to say less than 24 hours after telling me that I was a burden, and that they would all be better off if I were dead. "Hello," I said, my voice neutral. "Mom." Tyler's voice came through the speaker, and he sounded different somehow, less confident than usual. "How are you doing today?" The question was so absurd that I almost laughed. "How am I doing?" "That's an interesting question, Tyler. How do you think I'm doing?" "Look, Mom, I was calling because I wanted to talk about last night. I think maybe things got a little heated, and some things were said that maybe shouldn't have been said." "Some things were said," I repeated slowly. "Is that how you're remembering it? That some things were just said?" "Mom, you know how Cassie gets when she's stressed. And Marcus has been working really long hours. We were all just tired and frustrated." I marveled at his ability to minimize what had happened. "Tyler, your sister told me that you would all be better off if I were dead. Your brother called me a burden. You sat there and agreed with both of them. How exactly does being tired and stressed excuse?" There was a pause, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "Maybe we could have handled it better," he said finally. "But Mom, you have to understand our position. We really can't afford to give you $8,000 right now." "I understand your position perfectly," I said calmly. "You've made it very clear. So what are you going to do about the house?" he asked, and I could hear genuine curiosity in his voice. "Did you figure something else out?" I smiled, even though he couldn't see me. "Actually, yes, I did figure something out." "Really? What?" "I realized that you were absolutely right about everything you said last night." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "What do you mean?" Tyler asked cautiously. "I mean that you were right when you said I was being a burden. You were right when you said you shouldn't have to take care of me. You were right when you said I needed to be more independent." "Oh," Tyler said, and he sounded confused. "Okay. So what does that mean exactly?" "It means I'm going to stop being a burden," I said cheerfully, "starting right now." "That's great, Mom. So you found another way to handle the mortgage situation." "Something like that," I said vaguely. "Tyler, I want you to know that I've been doing a lot of thinking since last night, and I've come to some important realizations." "What kind of realizations?" "I realize that I've been approaching this whole relationship wrong. I've been acting like a mother instead of acting like a stranger. And since you've made it clear that's what I am to you, I'm going to start treating you accordingly." "Mom, what are you talking about? You're not a stranger." "Aren't I?" I asked. "Tyler, when was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you asked about my life, my interests, my feelings about anything?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I guess I've been busy." "Busy?" I nodded. "Right. Well, the good news is that you're going to be a lot less busy now, because you won't have to worry about maintaining a relationship with me anymore." "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what it sounds like. You don't want a mother, Tyler. You want someone who gives you things and asks for nothing in return. Since I can't be that person anymore, I'm going to stop trying to be any kind of person to you at all." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "Mom, You're scaring me a little bit. What are you planning to do? I'm planning to give you exactly what you asked for, I said simply. Freedom from me. But what about the house? What about the foreclosure? That's not your problem, remember? You made that very clear last night. You said you're adults with your own lives and your own responsibilities. So I'm going to handle my responsibilities the same way you handle yours. Alone. Mom, if you're thinking about doing something drastic, the only thing I'm thinking about doing is living my life without pretending that my children care about me, I interrupted. Tyler, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Last night was the last time you will ever have the opportunity to hurt me, because from now on you don't exist to me. You don't mean that? I absolutely mean it. And Tyler, when you and your siblings realize what you've lost, when you understand what you've thrown away, don't bother trying to contact me, because I won't be taking your calls. I hung up before he could respond and immediately blocked his number. Then I blocked Marcus and Cassie as well. It felt liberating, like cutting chains that had been weighing me down for years. Within an hour, my landline started ringing. I let it go to voicemail, and when I checked the messages, they were all from my children. Tyler sounded panicked, Marcus sounded annoyed, and Cassie sounded angry. They all wanted to know what I was planning, what I meant by my cryptic comments, whether I was having some kind of breakdown. I deleted all the messages without listening to them completely and unplugged the landline from the wall. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and began writing letters. Not to my children, but to my neighbors, my few remaining friends, and the handful of distant relatives who still kept in touch. I wanted to make sure that if anything happened to me, people would know the truth about what my children had done. I wasn't planning to hurt myself. Despite what my children had said about being better off if I were dead, I had no intention of making their wish come true. But I was old enough to be realistic about mortality, and I wanted to make sure that my children couldn't rewrite history after I was gone. In each letter, I explained what had happened at the family dinner, what my children had said to me, and how they had treated me when I asked for their help. I didn't exaggerate or embellish. I just told the truth in simple, clear language. I also explained about my hidden assets and my decision to leave everything to charity. I wanted people to understand that my children weren't just cruel, they were also foolish. They had thrown away millions of dollars because they couldn't be bothered to treat their mother with basic decency. As I sealed the last letter, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since their father died, I wasn't worried about my children's opinion of me. I wasn't trying to earn their love or approval. I wasn't making decisions based on what they might think or how they might react. I was finally free to be myself, to make choices based on what I wanted instead of what they needed. And what I wanted was to never see any of them again. The next morning, I woke up feeling more rested than I had in months. I made myself a proper breakfast, something I hadn't done in weeks, and sat at my kitchen table reading the newspaper while I ate. It was peaceful, quiet. Exactly the kind of morning my children would have found boring and depressing. I realized that I had been living my life according to their values, their priorities, their definition of what mattered. They thought success meant expensive clothes and fancy cars and impressive job titles. They thought happiness meant constant stimulation and entertainment and social media validation. But sitting there in my kitchen, eating toast and reading about the local community garden that was looking for volunteers, I remembered what actually made me happy. Simple pleasures, quiet moments, the satisfaction of helping others without expecting anything in return. I finished my breakfast and walked to my computer, where I spent the morning researching volunteer opportunities. I signed up to help at a local food bank, to read to children at the public library, and to assist with a program that taught computer skills to senior citizens. For the first time in years, I was making plans that had nothing to do with my children's schedules or needs or approval. I was making plans for a life that belonged entirely to me. Around noon, I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked out the window and saw Marcus getting out of his expensive sedan, his face grim and determined. He walked up to my front door and knocked loudly. I didn't answer. I just sat in my living room and waited for him to give up and leave. He knocked for several minutes, then started calling my name. Mom, I know you're in there. Your car is in the driveway. Open the door. We need to talk. I remained silent, watching him through the window as he paced back and forth on my front porch. Finally, he pulled out his phone and tried calling me, but of course the call went straight to voicemail since I had blocked his number. After about 20 minutes, he got back in his car and drove away. But he was back an hour later with Cassie. They both got out of the car and approached my front door together, their body language aggressive and entitled. This time, Cassie did the knocking, and when I didn't answer, she started shouting, "Mom, this is ridiculous. Open the door right now. We know you're in there, and we're not leaving until you talk to us." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Yesterday, they had told me I was a burden and that they would be better off if I were dead. Today, they were demanding access to me like I owed them something. They stayed on my porch for almost an hour, taking turns knocking and shouting and trying to peek through my windows. At one point, Cassie tried to use the spare key that I kept hidden under a flower pot, but I had moved it months ago after she had let herself into my house without permission one too many times. Eventually, they gave up and left, but not before Cassie shouted one final message through my front door. "Fine, Mom. Have it your way. But when you come to your senses and realize you need us, don't expect us to be here waiting for you." I smiled as I heard their car doors slam and their engines start. They still didn't understand. They still thought this was about me needing them. They still believed that eventually I would come crawling back, apologizing for my behavior and begging for their forgiveness. They had no idea that I didn't need them at all. They had no idea that I had more money than all three of them combined. They had no idea that they had just lost the best thing that ever happened to them. And they had no idea that in a few weeks, when my new will was finalized, they would discover exactly how much their cruelty had cost them. I spent the rest of the day in blissful solitude, reading a book I had been meaning to start for months, and planning the garden I wanted to plant in the spring. For the first time in years, I made decisions without considering anyone else's opinions or needs. It felt like being reborn. 2 weeks had passed since I had blocked my children's phone numbers and stopped answering my door when they came by. The silence was golden. I had forgotten what it felt like to wake up in the morning without immediately worrying about which one of them might call with a complaint or a demand. I had forgotten the peace of eating a meal without being interrupted by someone who needed something from me. During those 2 weeks, I had kept myself busy with the volunteer work I had signed up for. At the food bank, I sorted donations and helped pack boxes for families in need. At the library, I read stories to wide-eyed children who actually listened and appreciated my efforts. At the senior center, I helped elderly people learn to use computers and smartphones, teaching them how to video chat with their grandchildren who lived far away. It was ironic, really. I was surrounded by people who valued my time and expertise, who thanked me for my help and treated me with respect. Meanwhile, my own children were probably still trying to figure out why I wasn't answering their calls. The meeting with David Chen was scheduled for a Friday morning at 10 o'clock. I dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a navy blue suit that I had bought years ago but rarely had reason to wear. I wanted to look professional, competent, like the successful investor I had secretly been for over a decade. David's office was in a gleaming downtown high-rise, the kind of building my children would have been impressed by if they had known I had any reason to be there. The receptionist greeted me warmly and offered me coffee while I waited. Everything about the experience reminded me that I was not the desperate, powerless woman my children believed me to be. When David called me into his office, he looked concerned. He was a kind man in his early 50s who had always treated me with respect and patience, even when I was making relatively small investments in the beginning. "Lorene," he said as I sat down across from his desk, "I have to admit, I've been worried about you since our phone call. Cutting your children out of your will completely, that's a huge decision. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do?" I smiled at him, the same calm smile I had been practicing in the mirror for 2 weeks. "David, I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He pulled out a thick folder and opened it on his desk. "Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand exactly what you're giving up. Your current net worth, including the data flow stock, the commercial property, your savings accounts, and your retirement funds, is approximately $2.8 million. The number still amazed me, even though I had known it was growing. When I had made that first small investment 15 years ago, I never could have imagined it would turn into this kind of wealth. Your children stand to inherit a significant fortune, David continued. Are you sure you want to give that up because of one bad argument? I leaned forward in my chair, meeting his eyes directly. David, it wasn't one bad argument. It was the final revelation of who my children really are. Let me ask you something. If you had raised 3 children, sacrificed everything for them, worked multiple jobs to pay for their education, and then when you needed help, they told you that you were a burden, and that they would be better off if you were dead, what would you do? David's expression softened. They actually said that to you? Those exact words, I confirmed. And when I asked them for help with a mortgage that I could easily pay off myself, they refused, not because they couldn't afford it, but because they didn't think I was worth it. He was quiet for a moment, reading through the papers in the folder. I have the new will prepared, he said finally. Everything goes to the charitable trust you specified. The Single Mother's Assistance Fund, the First Generation College Scholarship Program, and the Elderly Housing Preservation Foundation will each receive equal shares. Perfect, I said. And the personal bequests? Nothing to your children, as requested. You've left your grandmother's jewelry to your neighbor Margaret Torres, your book collection to the public library, and your car to the food bank where you volunteer. I nodded in satisfaction. Every decision had been deliberate. Margaret had always admired my grandmother's pearl necklace and would treasure it. The library would appreciate having books to sell at their annual fundraiser. The food bank could use my reliable car to make deliveries to homebound seniors. There is one thing I want to add, I said as David prepared the signature pages. I want to include a letter to be read at the will reading. Something that explains my decision. David looked uncomfortable. Lorene, are you sure that's wise? A letter like that, it could be seen as vindictive. I don't care how it's seen, I replied firmly. I want my children to understand exactly why they're getting nothing. I want them to know that this wasn't a mistake or an oversight. I want them to know that their cruelty had consequences. We spent another hour going over the details and signing documents. When everything was finalized, David walked me to the elevator. I hope you know what you're doing, he said as we shook hands. I know exactly what I'm doing, I assured him. For the first time in years, I'm making a decision based on what I want, instead of what other people expect from me. As I drove home from David's office, I felt lighter than I had in months. The paperwork was done. My children's fate was sealed. They had chosen to reject me when they thought I was powerless, and now they would live with the consequences of that choice. But my peace was short-lived. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw Tyler's beat-up Honda parked on the street in front of my house. He was sitting on my front porch steps looking disheveled and agitated. As I got out of my car, he jumped up and hurried toward me. "Mom, thank God," he said, his voice strained with emotion. "I've been waiting here for 2 hours. We need to talk." I walked past him toward my front door, not acknowledging his presence. He followed close behind me, talking rapidly. "Mom, this has gone on long enough. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this silent treatment is crazy. We're family. We can work this out." I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, but before I could close it, Tyler pushed his way in behind me. "Tyler," I said calmly, turning to face him, "you're trespassing. Please leave my house immediately." He stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language. "Trespassing? Mom, this is my childhood home. You can't trespass in your own family's house." "This is my house," I corrected him, "and you are no longer welcome here." His face flushed red with frustration. "What is wrong with you? Ever since that dinner 2 weeks ago, you've been acting like a completely different person. You won't answer your phone, you won't come to the door, and now you're treating me like a stranger." I walked to my kitchen and put my purse down on the counter, moving with deliberate calm. Tyler followed me, his agitation growing. "Mom, talk to me. Tell me what's going on. Are you having some kind of breakdown? Are you sick? Do you need to see a doctor?" I turned to look at him, this young man who had once been the baby I had rocked to sleep every night for the first 2 years of his life. He looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't understand why his behavior might have consequences. "Tyler," I said quietly, "do you remember what you said to me 2 weeks ago?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Look, maybe things got heated. Maybe we all said things we didn't mean." "I didn't say anything I didn't mean," I replied. "Did you?" He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him trying to figure out the right answer. "Mom, you have to understand, we were all stressed that night. Cassie's been having problems at work. Marcus is dealing with his own financial pressures, and I've been worried about finding a better job. When you sprung that whole mortgage thing on us, it just felt like one more problem we couldn't handle." I marveled at his ability to make excuses. Even now, faced with the consequences of his cruelty, he was trying to justify it instead of taking responsibility for it. "So you're saying that being stressed gives you the right to tell your mother that the world would be better off if she were dead?" Tyler's face went pale. "I didn't say that. That was Cassie." "But you agreed with her," I pointed out. "You sat there and nodded when she said it. You didn't defend me or tell her she was wrong. You just agreed that your mother should die." "I didn't mean it like that," he said weakly. "How did you mean it, Tyler?" He opened and closed his mouth several times, but no words came out. "Here's what I think," I continued, my voice still calm and measured. "I think you meant exactly what you said. I think all three of you have been wishing for years that I would just disappear so you wouldn't have to deal with me anymore. The only difference is that Cassie was honest enough to say it out loud." Tyler slumped against my kitchen counter, suddenly looking much younger than his 23 years. "Mom, that's not true. We don't want you to disappear. We just wish things were easier sometimes." "Easier," I repeated. "You wish I was easier to deal with?" "Yes," he said, and for a moment I thought he might be about to show some genuine emotion. "Mom, it's hard being your kid sometimes. You expect so much from us. You're always disappointed when we don't live up to your standards. Sometimes it feels like nothing we do is ever good enough for you." I stared at him in amazement. "Tyler, I have never criticized any of you for not living up to my standards. I have supported every decision you've made, even when I thought you were making mistakes. When you dropped out of college the first time, I didn't say a word. When you quit 3 different jobs in 6 months, I didn't lecture you. When you've been living in my basement for over a year without paying rent or contributing to household expenses, I haven't complained once." He looked uncomfortable, but he pressed on. "But we can feel your disappointment, Mom. We can see it in your face when we tell you about our lives. You try to hide it, but we know you think we're failures." "I think you're failures?" I asked incredulously. "Tyler, I have never thought any of you were failures. Disappointing, yes. Selfish, absolutely. But not failures. See?" he said, pointing at me accusingly. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You think we're disappointing and selfish. How is that supposed to make us feel?" I felt like I was having a conversation with an alien. This young man was actually angry at me for being disappointed in his behavior. He was upset that I found his selfishness disappointing. He wanted me to approve of, and celebrate the very traits that made him treat me badly. "Tyler," I said slowly, "you are disappointing and selfish. That's not an opinion, it's an observable fact. You live in my house without paying rent, you eat my food, you use my utilities, and you contribute nothing to the household. When I asked for help with a financial crisis, you refused, and then told me I was a burden. Those are the actions of a disappointing and selfish person." His face twisted with anger. "So that's it? You're just going to hold this over our heads forever? You're going to punish us for one bad night?" "I'm not punishing you," I said calmly. "I'm protecting myself from you." "Protecting yourself? From your own children?" "Especially from my own children," I replied. "Tyler, the people who have the power to hurt us most are the people we love most. You and your siblings used that power to devastate me, and I'm not going to give you the opportunity to do it again." Tyler ran his hands through his hair, looking increasingly desperate. "Mom, what do you want from us? Do you want us to apologize? Fine, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what we said, I'm sorry for how we acted, I'm sorry for everything. Can we please just go back to normal now?" I looked at this young man who was offering me the most hollow, meaningless apology I had ever heard, and I felt nothing but pity for him. "Tyler, do you know what a real apology looks like?" He stared at me blankly. A real apology starts with taking full responsibility for what you did wrong, without making excuses or blaming other people. Then you express genuine remorse for the harm you caused. Then you commit to changing your behavior so it doesn't happen again. And finally, you accept that the person you hurt has the right to decide whether or not to forgive you. I paused, watching his face as I spoke. Your apology started with fine and ended with a demand that I forgive you immediately. That's not an apology, Tyler. That's manipulation. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to process what I was saying. So what are you going to do? He asked finally. Are you just going to cut us out of your life forever? That's exactly what I'm going to do, I confirmed. But why? We said we were sorry. I almost laughed at his obtuseness. Tyler, 2 weeks ago you told me that you would be better off if I were dead. Today you're asking me why I don't want a relationship with you anymore. Do you genuinely not understand the connection between those two things? He was quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe he was finally starting to comprehend the situation. Mom, he said finally, his voice small and uncertain. What about the house? Are you going to lose it? And there it was. Even in the middle of what should have been an emotional conversation about our relationship, he was still thinking about the house. He was still worried about his potential inheritance. No, Tyler, I said with a smile. I'm not going to lose the house. Relief flooded his face. Oh, good. So you found another way to handle the mortgage situation? Something like that, I said vaguely. That's great, Mom. I'm so glad you figured it out. See, you didn't need our help after all. Everything worked out for the best. I stared at him in amazement. He was actually trying to spin my financial recovery as validation for their refusal to help me. In his mind, the fact that I had managed to solve the problem without them proved that they had been right to abandon me. Tyler, I said quietly, I want you to leave now. But Mom, we're finally talking again. Can't we work this out? We have nothing to work out, I replied firmly. You've made your position clear, and I've made mine clear. Now please leave my house. He stood there for another moment, looking like he wanted to argue. But something in my expression must have convinced him that I was serious, because he finally headed toward the front door. Mom, he said as he reached for the doorknob, I hope you know what you're doing, because once you push us away, we might not come back. I smiled at him one last time. Tyler, that's exactly what I'm counting on. After he left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my living room, feeling exhausted but victorious. The conversation had confirmed everything I already knew about my children. They were incapable of genuine remorse, incapable of taking responsibility for their actions, and incapable of understanding that other people had feelings that mattered. But it had also shown me something else. They were worried about the house, which meant they were worried about their inheritance. They still had no idea that I had any significant assets beyond this modest suburban home. They had no idea what they were about to lose. Over the next few days, I noticed that my children were stepping up their efforts to contact me. Cassie started leaving long voicemails on my landline, which I had plugged back in but set to silent. Marcus sent me several emails, which I deleted without reading. Tyler even tried to enlist Margaret's help, asking her to convince me to talk to them. Margaret told me about Tyler's visit when she came over for our weekly coffee date. He seemed genuinely upset, she said as we sat in my kitchen. He kept saying that he didn't understand what was happening, that you were acting like a different person. I am a different person, I told her. I'm a person who finally understands that love should be mutual, and respect should be earned. Margaret nodded approvingly. Good for you, Lorene. I've been watching you sacrifice yourself for those children for years, and I've always wondered when you would finally stand up for yourself. It only took them telling me I should die, I said with dark humor. Margaret's face hardened. I still can't believe they said that to you, their own mother, after everything you've done for them. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping our coffee and watching the birds at the feeder I had hung outside my kitchen window. Margaret, I said finally, can I tell you something in confidence? Of course. I took a deep breath, preparing to share my secret with another person for the first time in years. My children think I'm poor. They think this house and my social security check are all I have in the world. Margaret looked confused. Aren't they? I smiled. Not even close. Margaret, I'm worth almost $3 million. Her coffee cup clattered against the saucer as she set it down abruptly. Lorene Butler, are you pulling my leg? Not at all, I said, enjoying her shocked expression. I've been investing in the stock market for 15 years, and I own commercial real estate downtown. My children have no idea. Margaret stared at me for a long moment, then started laughing. Oh my God, Lorene, do you realize what this means? It means that when they refused to help me with $8,000, they were essentially refusing to help a millionaire who was testing their character. Margaret laughed even harder, and they failed the test spectacularly. Completely and utterly, I agreed. So what are you going to do? Are you going to tell them? I shook my head. I've already done something better than that. I've changed my will. They're getting nothing. Margaret's eyes widened. Nothing? Not even this house? Nothing, I confirmed. Everything goes to charity. Margaret sat back in her chair, processing this information. Lorene, that's incredible. They have no idea what they've lost. Not yet, I said. But they will. That afternoon, I decided to take a drive through the downtown area where my commercial property was located. I hadn't visited the building in months, and I wanted to see how my tenants were doing. The coffee shop on the ground floor was busy, as usual, with a line of customers waiting to order. The apartments upstairs were well maintained and fully occupied. As I sat in my car across the street, watching people come and go from my building, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was mine. I had bought it with my own money. Money I had earned and invested wisely. My children knew nothing about it, and now they never would. I thought about all the years I had spent worrying about their financial futures, planning for their inheritances, imagining the day when I could surprise them with the security I had built for them. What a waste of time and emotional energy that had been. Now, instead of going to 3 ungrateful children who thought I was a burden, my money would go to people who actually needed it. Single mothers who were struggling the way I had struggled. Students who were working multiple jobs to pay for their education the way I had worked to pay for my children's education. Elderly people who were facing foreclosure the way I had pretended to face foreclosure. The irony was delicious. My money would help people who reminded me of myself, people who understood the value of hard work and sacrifice. It would never benefit the people who had taken my sacrifices for granted. As I drove home, I passed by Marcus's condominium complex. His expensive car was in the parking lot, and I could see lights on in what I knew was his unit. For a moment, I imagined him sitting inside, probably working on his laptop, completely unaware that his cruel words 2 weeks ago had cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars. I felt no guilt about my decision. If anything, I felt proud of myself for finally having the courage to stop rewarding bad behavior. I had spent years enabling my children's selfishness by always being available to help them, always putting their needs before my own, always forgiving them when they disappointed me. Well, those days were over. They had finally pushed me too far, said something too cruel, revealed their true nature too clearly for me to ignore anymore. I spent the evening writing in my journal, documenting everything that had happened since that terrible family dinner. I wrote about my children's refusal to help me, about their cruel words, about my decision to change my will. I wanted to have a record of my thought process, something that would explain my actions to anyone who might question them later. I also wrote about how I felt, which was surprisingly good. I had expected to feel sad or guilty about cutting my children out of my life, but instead I felt relieved. I felt free. I felt like I could finally be myself instead of constantly trying to be the mother they wanted me to be. As I prepared for bed, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Gone was the anxious, people-pleasing mother who had spent decades worrying about everyone else's happiness. In her place was a confident, self-possessed woman who had finally learned to value herself. I smiled at my reflection, and the woman in the mirror smiled back. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts from my children to manipulate their way back into my good graces. but I was ready for them. They had no idea who they were dealing with now. 3 months had passed since I last spoke to any of my children, and the transformation in my life had been remarkable. I woke up each morning without the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach, wondering which child would call with a crisis or complaint. I ate my meals in peace, read books without interruption, and went to bed each night feeling content instead of worried. My volunteer work had become a source of tremendous joy. At the food bank, I had been promoted to coordinator of the senior outreach program. At the library, I had started a weekly storytelling circle that had grown from 3 children to 15. At the senior center, I was teaching a computer class that was so popular they had to start a waiting list. For the first time in decades, I was living for myself, and it felt incredible. The foreclosure notice that had started this whole ordeal was now just an unpleasant memory. I had paid off the entire mortgage in one lump sum, using money from my savings account. The relief on the bank officer's face when I walked in with a cashier's check had been almost comical. He had clearly expected me to lose the house and had been preparing the paperwork for seizure. Instead, I owned my home free and clear, with no monthly mortgage payments to worry about. The financial freedom was intoxicating. I could afford to travel, to renovate the house, to donate generously to causes I cared about. I could live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever worrying about money again. My children, of course, knew none of this. As far as they were concerned, I had somehow managed to scrape together the money to avoid foreclosure, probably by taking on more debt or finding some desperate solution that would only postpone the inevitable. I had seen each of them around town occasionally: Cassie at the grocery store, Marcus at the gas station, Tyler at the coffee shop where he still worked part-time. Each time they had looked at me with expressions of hurt confusion, as if they couldn't understand why I continued to ignore them. Each time I had simply looked through them as if they were strangers, which in many ways they had become. The first real test of my resolve came on a Tuesday morning in early February. I was in my garden, planting the flower beds I wanted to plant in the spring, when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. I looked up to see a woman I didn't recognize walking toward my front door. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair and nervous eyes. I stood up, brushing soil from my hands, and walked around to the front of the house to meet her. "Mrs. Butler?" she asked tentatively as I approached. "Yes, I'm Lorene Butler." She seemed to struggle with what to say next. "My name is Sarah Martinez. I'm Tyler's girlfriend." I felt a flicker of interest despite myself. Tyler had never mentioned having a girlfriend, but then again, we hadn't spoken in months. "What can I do for you, Sarah?" She looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot on my front porch. "Tyler asked me to come talk to you. He said you two had some kind of misunderstanding, and he thought maybe you'd be willing to listen to someone who wasn't involved." I almost smiled at Tyler's manipulation. He had sent his girlfriend to do what he couldn't do himself, probably betting that I would be more receptive to a young woman than to him. "What did Tyler tell you about this misunderstanding?" I asked. Sarah's face scrunched up in concentration, as if she was trying to remember a rehearsed speech. "He said that you asked him and his siblings for help with some money problems, and when they couldn't help, you got upset and stopped talking to them. He said he thinks you're depressed or maybe having some kind of breakdown, and he's really worried about you." I nodded slowly, unsurprised by Tyler's version of events. In his telling, he and his siblings were the victims of an unreasonable and mentally unstable mother who had overreacted to their perfectly reasonable refusal to help her. "That's an interesting interpretation of what happened," I said calmly. Sarah looked hopeful. "So you're willing to work things out?" "Tyler said he'd do anything to fix this. He misses you so much, Mrs. Butler. He talks about you all the time." I studied this young woman, who seemed genuinely sweet and well-meaning. She had clearly been manipulated into believing that she was helping to reunite a family, when in reality she was being used as a pawn in Tyler's attempt to restore his access to what he thought was his inheritance. "Sarah," I said gently, "what has Tyler told you about his childhood? About the kind of mother I was?" She brightened, apparently thinking this was a good sign. "Oh, he talks about you all the time. He says you were amazing. That you worked so hard to take care of him and his brother and sister after their dad died. He says you made all kinds of sacrifices to make sure they had everything they needed. And yet when I needed help, where was he? Sarah's smile faltered. Well, he said they just couldn't afford to help you right then. Tyler's been struggling to find steady work, and his brother and sister have their own bills to worry about. I nodded again, unsurprised that Tyler had painted himself and his siblings as financially strapped, when the truth was that they simply hadn't wanted to be inconvenienced. Sarah, can I ask you something personal? Sure. How much do you pay Tyler for rent? She looked confused. Rent? He doesn't charge me rent. I stay at his place, sometimes, but he lives with his mom. He lives with you. I felt a spark of anger, quickly suppressed. Tyler told you he lives with me? Well, yeah. He said he's been staying in your basement while he gets back on his feet after college. He said you've been really supportive of him taking his time to find the right job instead of just taking anything. The lies were breathtaking. Tyler had told his girlfriend that I was a supportive mother who was helping him through a difficult transition, when the reality was that he was a 23-year-old man who had been freeloading off me for over a year while contributing nothing to the household. Sarah, I said carefully, Tyler doesn't live with me anymore. Her face went blank with confusion. What do you mean? I mean that Tyler moved out 3 months ago. He hasn't lived in my house since December. The poor girl looked completely lost. But he told me he was staying here. When I drop him off after our dates, he always goes inside this house. I felt a chill run down my spine. He goes inside this house? Yes, he uses his key and everything. He said you gave him a key so he could come and go without disturbing you. I realized with growing alarm that Tyler had been entering my house without my knowledge or permission. The spare key that Cassie had tried to use months ago had never been moved from its hiding place. I had simply forgotten about it. Sarah, I need you to understand something very important. Tyler does not live here. He does not have permission to be in my house. If he's been entering my home without my knowledge, that's breaking and entering. Sarah's face went pale. I don't understand. Why would he lie to me about something like that? I felt genuinely sorry for this young woman, who had clearly been deceived about the basic facts of her boyfriend's life. I think you should ask Tyler that question, I said gently. But Sarah, I want you to know that whatever Tyler has told you about our relationship, about what happened between us, it's not the whole truth. Tears started forming in her eyes. But he said you were just going through a rough time. And that's why you weren't talking to him. He said you'd been like a mother to me once you got to know me. The manipulation was even worse than I had thought. Tyler had been promising this poor girl a relationship with me, using the prospect of maternal affection to keep her invested in his version of events. Sarah, I'm sorry, but Tyler and I don't have a relationship anymore. We haven't spoken in 3 months, and I have no intention of changing that. Whatever he's told you about reconciling with me, it's not going to happen. She stared at me for a moment, then turned and walked quickly back to her car. I watched her drive away, her shoulders shaking with what I assumed were tears. As soon as she was gone, I walked around to the back of my house and found the spare key exactly where it had always been, under the decorative rock near my back door. I picked it up and went inside, my mind racing with the implications of what I had just learned. If Tyler had been entering my house without permission, what else had he been doing? Had he been searching through my belongings? Had he been looking for financial documents or valuables? Had he been trying to find evidence of assets I might have hidden? I spent the next hour going through my house systematically, looking for signs that someone had been inside. I checked my desk drawers, my filing cabinets, my jewelry box, my bedroom closet. At first, I didn't notice anything obviously disturbed. But then I realized that several things were slightly out of place in ways that suggested someone had been looking through them. My important papers, which I kept in a locked filing cabinet, showed signs of having been disturbed. The lock hadn't been broken, but the files inside were not quite in the order I remembered leaving them. My computer had been moved slightly on my desk, and when I checked the browser history, I found searches that I hadn't made. Someone had been looking up information about my mortgage, my property taxes, and even my credit report. The violation felt almost physical. Tyler had not only lied to his girlfriend and used her to try to manipulate me, but he had also been secretly entering my home and going through my private belongings. The betrayal was complete. I called a locksmith immediately and had all the locks on my house changed. Then I called the security company and had a complete alarm system installed, with cameras covering all the entrances to my property. If Tyler or anyone else tried to enter my house without permission again, I would have evidence for the police. That evening, as I was reviewing the footage from my new security cameras on my laptop, I saw Tyler approaching my back door. He tried his key in the lock, looking puzzled when it didn't work. He tried it several more times, then walked around to the front door and tried that lock as well. When he realized that the locks had been changed, he stood on my front porch for several minutes, apparently trying to decide what to do next. Finally, he pulled out his phone and made a call. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his body language suggested anger and frustration. After ending the call, he walked back to his car and drove away. 20 minutes later, my landline rang. I let it go to voicemail, and when I checked the message, it was from Cassie. "Mom, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it needs to stop. Tyler called me crying because you told his girlfriend a bunch of lies about him, and now she's threatening to break up with him. And apparently you changed the locks on the house? What is wrong with you? Call me back immediately." I deleted the message without a second thought. The fact that Cassie's primary concern was Tyler's relationship with his girlfriend, rather than the fact that he had been illegally entering my home, told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. The next morning, I received an unexpected visitor. Margaret knocked on my door around 9 o'clock, looking uncharacteristically serious. "Lorene," she said when I opened the door, "we need to talk." I invited her in and made coffee while she settled herself at my kitchen table. She looked nervous, which was unusual for Margaret, who was normally very direct and confident. "What's on your mind?" I asked as I poured the coffee. "I got a very interesting phone call last night," she said slowly. "From your daughter, Cassie." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? What did she want?" "She wanted to know if I thought you were having some kind of mental breakdown. She said you'd been acting erratically, making irrational decisions, pushing away your family for no reason." I sipped my coffee and waited for Margaret to continue. "She also wanted to know if I knew anything about your finances. She asked if you'd mentioned having money problems, if you'd asked me for help with bills, if I'd noticed you selling things or acting desperate." "And what did you tell her?" Margaret smiled grimly. "I told her that you seemed perfectly fine to me, and that your finances were none of her business. But Lorene, she seemed really desperate to get information about you. She kept pushing, asking if I'd noticed any changes in your behavior, if you'd said anything about your plans for the future." I wasn't surprised. My children were probably starting to panic, as they realized that their strategy of ignoring me until I came crawling back wasn't working. They were likely wondering if I had other sources of support, other ways of managing my problems that didn't involve them. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you. Tyler has been entering my house without permission. I found out yesterday that he's been using a spare key to come inside when I'm not home." Margaret's eyes widened. "Lorene, that's breaking and entering. You could have him arrested." "I know, I've changed all the locks and installed a security system, but I think he was looking for something. My papers were disturbed. My computer had been used to search for financial information about me." "They're trying to figure out if you have money?" Margaret said immediately. "That's what this is about. They want to know if you're really as desperate as you claimed to be." I nodded. "I think you're right. And I think they're starting to realize that maybe I'm not as helpless as they assumed." Margaret leaned back in her chair, processing this information. "Lorene, what are you going to do if they find out about your investments?" "They're not going to find out," I said firmly. "I've been very careful to keep those accounts separate and private. And even if they did find out, it wouldn't matter. The will has already been changed. They're getting nothing regardless of what they know. But if they found out how much money you have, they might try to contest the will. They might claim you were mentally incompetent when you made the changes." I hadn't thought of that possibility, but Margaret was right. If my children discovered that I had been secretly wealthy while asking them for help, they might argue that my behavior proved I was mentally unstable. "What do you think I should do?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I think you should make sure there's plenty of evidence that you're mentally competent and making rational decisions. Medical records, statements from friends and neighbors, documentation of your volunteer work. Build a paper trail that shows you're thinking clearly. It was good advice. I spent the rest of the week gathering the documentation Margaret had suggested. I made an appointment with my doctor for a complete physical and mental health evaluation. I asked the coordinators at the food bank, library, and senior center to write letters describing my volunteer work and my interactions with other people. I even asked my financial advisor to document our meetings and my decision-making process regarding the will changes. By the end of the week, I had a thick folder of evidence proving that I was mentally competent and fully capable of making my own decisions about my money and my relationships. But I also realized that I was tired of living in a defensive posture, constantly preparing for my children's next attack. It was time to take control of the situation completely. On a sunny Saturday morning in March, I made a decision that would change everything. I called David Chen and asked him to schedule a meeting for the following Monday. Then I called the directors of the 3 charities that would be benefiting from my estate. I told them that I wanted to make a significant donation while I was still alive, and that I wanted to do it publicly. "How significant are we talking about?" asked the director of the Single Mothers Assistance Fund. $2.5 million, I said calmly, split equally among the 3 organizations. The silence on the other end of the line was so long that I thought the call had been disconnected. "Mrs. Butler," she said finally, "did you say $2.5 million? I did. I want to make the donation next week, and I want you to coordinate with the local newspaper to cover the story. I want this to be as public as possible." The director was nearly speechless with excitement and gratitude. We talked for another few minutes about the logistics, and then I made similar calls to the other 2 organizations. By Monday afternoon, everything was arranged. The donations would be processed on Wednesday, and the newspaper would run the story on Thursday. The headline would read, "Local woman donates fortune to charity in honor of late husband." I would keep enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, but the bulk of my wealth would go to people who actually deserved it. And my children would find out about it the same way everyone else did, by reading about it in the newspaper. Wednesday morning, I dressed carefully for my appointment at David Chen's office. I wore a simple black dress, and my grandmother's pearl necklace, the same necklace I had left to Margaret in my will. I wanted to look dignified and competent, like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The paperwork for the donations took less than an hour to complete. David still seemed concerned about my decision, but he couldn't argue with the logic behind it. "Your Quinade. Children are going to be shocked when they find out about this," he said as we finished signing the documents. "Yes," I agreed, "they are. Are you prepared for their reaction?" I smiled. "David, I've been preparing for their reaction for months. I'm more than ready." When I left David's office, I felt lighter than I had in years. The money was gone, transferred to organizations that would use it to help people who actually needed help. My children could no longer hurt me with their rejection, because there was nothing left for them to reject. I drove home slowly, enjoying the spring sunshine and the sense of completion that settled over me like a warm blanket. Everything was finished. The will was settled, the donations were made, and my children's fate was sealed. That evening, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine and thought about the phone call I would receive tomorrow, after the newspaper story was published. I imagined Cassie's shock when she realized that her mother, the woman she had called a burden, had just given away millions of dollars. I imagined Marcus's fury when he understood that his inheritance had gone to strangers instead of to him. I imagined Tyler's devastation when he realized that his cruelty had cost him more money than he could ever hope to earn in his lifetime. But mostly, I imagined the peace I would feel when this chapter of my life was finally closed forever. Thursday morning dawned bright and clear. I woke up early and drove to the convenience store to buy a copy of the newspaper. There, on the front page of the local section, was my picture and the headline, "Local woman donates $2. $5 million to charity." The article was beautifully written, describing my late husband and my desire to honor his memory by helping people in need. It mentioned my volunteer work and quoted the directors of the charities expressing their gratitude for my generosity. It painted a picture of a woman who had lived modestly but saved wisely, and who had chosen to use her wealth to make a difference in the world. There was no mention of my children anywhere in the article. I bought 3 copies of the newspaper and drove home to wait. The first call came at 8:30 in the morning. Cassie's number showed up on my caller ID, but I let it go to voicemail. The second call came 5 minutes later, from Marcus. Then Tyler. Then Cassie again. By noon, I had received 47 phone calls from my children's numbers. I didn't answer any of them, but I did listen to a few of the voicemails out of curiosity. Cassie's messages progressed from shock to anger to desperation. "Mom, I just saw the newspaper. This has to be some kind of mistake. Call me back immediately." Then, "Mom, how could you give away our inheritance without even talking to us?" And finally, "Mom, please, we need to talk. I think you've made a terrible mistake." Marcus's messages were more direct. "Mom, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to fix this. That money belongs to our family." And, "Mom, I'm coming over tonight whether you answer the door or not. We're going to sort this out." Tyler's messages were the most pathetic. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening. Please call me back. I'm sorry for whatever I did wrong." And, "Mom, Sarah broke up with me because she said I lied to her about you. Please help me fix this." By evening, my driveway was full of cars. All 3 of my children had come to confront me, probably planning to present a united front that would force me to explain myself. I watched from my living room window as they stood on my front porch, taking turns knocking and shouting. They looked frantic, desperate, completely different from the confident, dismissive people who had sat at my dinner table 3 months ago. Eventually, Cassie started shouting loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Mom, we know you're in there. We saw the newspaper article. We know you've been lying to us. Open this door right now!" I smiled and picked up my phone. Instead of calling my children, I called the police. "I'd like to report a disturbance," I said calmly. 3 people are on my property refusing to leave, and they're shouting loud enough to disturb the neighborhood." The police arrived within 10 minutes. I watched from my window as the officer spoke to my children, who gestured frantically toward my house while they tried to explain the situation. Eventually, the officer came to my door. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Rodriguez. These folks say they're your children, and they need to speak with you about a family emergency." "Officer Rodriguez," I said politely, "these people are trespassing on my property. I've asked them to leave, and they've refused. I'd like them removed immediately." He looked confused. "Ma'am, they say you're their mother." "That may be true biologically," I said, "but I don't have a relationship with these people anymore. They're not welcome on my property." The officer studied my face, apparently trying to determine if I was mentally competent. "Ma'am, are you sure you don't want to speak with them? They seem very upset." "I'm positive," I said firmly. "Please remove them from my property." He returned to my children and spoke with them for several more minutes. I could see Cassie becoming increasingly agitated, waving her arms and pointing at my house. Finally, the officer returned to my door. "Ma'am, they're saying you recently donated a large sum of money to charity, and they're concerned about your mental state. They think you might not be thinking clearly." I had been prepared for this. I handed him the folder of documents I had assembled, including my recent medical evaluation and the letters from my volunteer coordinators. "Officer Rodriguez, as you can see from these documents, I'm mentally competent and fully capable of making my own decisions. The people on my porch are upset because they expected to inherit my money, and they've just learned that I chose to give it to charity instead. This is not a mental health issue. This is a family dispute, and I've chosen not to participate in it." He looked through the documents, taking his time to read the medical evaluation and the character references. Finally, he handed the folder back to me. "Ma'am, you seem perfectly capable of making your own decisions. I'm going to ask these folks to leave your property now." I watched from my window as Officer Rodriguez returned to my children and delivered the news. Cassie argued with him for several minutes, but eventually all 3 of them walked back to their cars. Before getting in, Cassie turned and shouted one final message toward my house. "This isn't over, Mom. You can't just throw away your family and expect everyone to be okay with it." But as I watched their cars disappear down my street, I knew that it was over. They had played their final card and it hadn't worked. They had tried to use the police, the newspaper story, and their own desperation to force me back into a relationship with them, and they had failed. I was finally, truly free. Over the next few weeks, the attempts to contact me gradually diminished. I received a few more voicemails, a couple of emails, and one letter delivered by hand. But eventually, even those stopped coming. The letter, which came about a month after the newspaper story, was from Marcus. It was 2 pages long and filled with accusations, threats, and demands. He accused me of lying, manipulating, and stealing their inheritance. He threatened to contest the will and to have me declared mentally incompetent. He demanded that I reverse the charitable donations and restore their inheritance. But buried in all the anger and entitlement was one line that revealed the truth of how my children saw me. "After everything we've done for you, how could you betray us like this?" I read that line several times, marveling at the complete reversal of reality it represented. In Marcus's mind, he and his siblings had been doing things for me, and my refusal to give them my money was a betrayal of their generosity. It was the perfect encapsulation of how they had always seen our relationship. They believed that simply existing as my children was a gift they had given me, something I should be grateful for. They believed that their presence in my life was so valuable that it entitled them to my money, my support, and my unconditional forgiveness for their cruelty. I put the letter in my filing cabinet next to all the other documentation of their behavior, and then I went outside to work in my garden. Spring had arrived in full force, and my flower beds were bursting with color. I had planted daffodils and tulips, roses and lavender, all the flowers I had always loved but never had time to properly tend when I was busy taking care of everyone else. As I knelt in the dirt, pulling weeds and deadheading spent blooms, I thought about the life I was building for myself. A life without drama, without manipulation, without people who took my love for granted. A life filled with meaningful work, genuine friendships, and the simple pleasure of growing beautiful things. My children had told me that the world would be better off if I were dead. Instead, I had discovered that my world was better off without them. The irony was delicious, and as I worked in my garden under the warm spring sun, I found myself smiling. 6 months after the newspaper story ran, I received an unexpected phone call from someone I hadn't heard from in years. My cousin Janet, who lived 3 states away, had somehow gotten hold of my new unlisted phone number. "Lorene," she said when I answered, her voice warm with genuine affection. "I saw the article about your donation online. I had to call and tell you how proud I am of you." It was the first time in months that someone had called me just to express pride in my actions, rather than to demand explanations or make accusations. The simple kindness of it brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you, Janet," I managed to say. "That means more to me than you know. I also wanted you to know that I heard from some other family members about what happened with your children. Word gets around, you know. And Lorene, I want you to know that not everyone thinks you were wrong." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, surprised by how much I needed to hear those words. For months, I had been operating on the assumption that most people would side with my children, that my decision to cut them off would be seen as cruel and unnatural. "What have you heard?" I asked carefully. Janet sighed. "Well, your sister-in-law Carol has been telling everyone who will listen that you've lost your mind and destroyed your family over money. But Lorene, those of us who knew you when the kids were growing up, we remember how hard you worked for them. We remember how you sacrificed everything for their benefit." She paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "What you did took incredible courage. And frankly, a lot of us have been wondering for years when you were going to stop letting those kids walk all over you." The validation was overwhelming. I had become so accustomed to second-guessing my own perceptions that hearing someone else confirm what I had experienced felt like a lifeline. "Janet, can I ask you something? Do you think I was wrong to cut them off completely? Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried harder to work things out." "Lorene Butler," Janet said firmly, "those children told you that the world would be better off if you were dead. There is no working things out from that. Some words can't be taken back, and some actions can't be forgiven. You did exactly what you should have done." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, processing the conversation. It had never occurred to me that there might be family members who supported my decision, people who had been watching my children's behavior over the years with the same growing concern I had felt. That evening, I decided to do something I had been avoiding for months. I logged into my email account and looked through the messages I had been ignoring. Most of them were from my children, but scattered among their increasingly desperate pleas were emails from other people. There was a message from my former coworker Linda, who had seen the newspaper article and wanted to congratulate me on my generosity. There was an email from my old neighbor from 2 houses down, who had moved to Florida but still kept in touch with Margaret. She wrote that she had always admired how I handled single motherhood and that she thought my children had turned out to be spoiled and entitled. There was even a message from Tyler's ex-girlfriend Sarah, who had apparently tracked down my email address to apologize for bothering me that day and to thank me for telling her the truth about Tyler. She wrote that breaking up with him had been difficult but necessary, and that she was grateful I had opened her eyes to his character. Reading these messages, I realized that I had been so focused on my children's rejection that I had failed to notice the support that existed around me. There were people who cared about me, who respected my decisions, who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could give them. Over the next few weeks, I began reaching out to some of these people. I had lunch with Linda, who told me stories about her own difficult adult children and how she had learned to set boundaries with them. I called my cousin Janet and we talked for hours about family dynamics and the difference between love and enabling. I even started dating again, something I hadn't done since my husband died 7 years earlier. Margaret had been encouraging me to try online dating for months, and I finally decided to give it a chance. I met a lovely man named Robert, a retired teacher whose wife had passed away 3 years ago. He was kind, funny, and completely uninterested in my financial situation, beyond making sure I could afford to split the dinner check. Our first few dates were tentative, both of us rusty at the art of romance. But gradually, we developed a comfortable friendship that began to grow into something deeper. Robert knew about my situation with my children, and he was endlessly supportive of my decision to prioritize my own well-being. "You know," he said one evening as we walked through the park near my house, "I think a lot of parents struggle with knowing when to stop sacrificing for their adult children. The difference is that most parents never get forced to confront the reality of how their children really see them." His words resonated with me deeply. I realized that my children's cruelty, while devastating at the time, had actually been a gift of sorts. It had forced me to see our relationship clearly, without the rose-colored glasses of maternal love that had been clouding my judgment for years. The autumn following my donation brought unexpected news. The Single Mothers Assistance Fund, one of the charities I had supported, invited me to their annual fundraising gala as their guest of honor. They wanted to recognize my contribution and give me the opportunity to see firsthand how my money was being used. I almost declined the invitation. The idea of being the center of attention at a large social event felt overwhelming. But Margaret convinced me to go, offering to accompany me as my guest. The gala was held at the city's most elegant hotel, and I felt nervous as we walked into the ballroom filled with hundreds of well-dressed people. But my anxiety quickly melted away as I began meeting the women who had been helped by my donation. There was Maria, a young mother who had escaped an abusive relationship and used the fund's assistance to get job training and find safe housing for herself and her 2 children. There was Jennifer, a widow who had received help with childcare costs while she went back to school to become a nurse. There was Amanda, a teenage mother who had been able to finish high school because the fund had provided tutoring and support services. Each woman I met had a story of struggle, determination, and hope. They thanked me with tears in their eyes, telling me how my generosity had changed their lives and given them opportunities they never could have afforded on their own. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by women who understood the value of sacrifice and hard work, I felt more fulfilled than I had ever felt as a mother. These women appreciated what I had given them. They didn't take my generosity for granted or demand more than I had offered. They were using my gift to build better lives for themselves and their children. This, I realized, was what it felt like to have your love and generosity appreciated and valued. The evening's program included speeches from several of the women who had been helped by the fund, and their stories were both heartbreaking and inspiring. As I listened to them talk about overcoming poverty, abuse, and discrimination, I thought about my own children and how different their lives had been. My children had never known hunger, homelessness, or real hardship. They had been given every advantage, every opportunity, every comfort I could provide. And yet they had grown up feeling entitled to even more, unable to appreciate what they had been given. These women, on the other hand, had faced genuine struggles and had learned to value every bit of help they received. They understood that generosity was a gift, not an obligation, and they treated it accordingly. When the funds director introduced me to the crowd and asked me to say a few words, I found myself speaking from the heart about the importance of helping people who truly needed and appreciated assistance. I talked about the satisfaction of knowing that my money was going to women who would use it wisely and gratefully. I didn't mention my children directly, but anyone who knew my story would have understood the subtext. I was investing in people who deserved investment, rather than enabling people who took my generosity for granted. The standing ovation I received was genuine and heartfelt, and as I looked out at the crowd of people celebrating my decision to give my money to charity, I felt a deep sense of rightness about the choices I had made. After the gala, my story began to spread beyond our local community. A blogger who had attended the event wrote about my donation and the unusual circumstances that had led to it. Her post went viral, and suddenly I was receiving interview requests from magazines and television shows. Most of the attention was positive. People seemed to identify with the story of a mother who had finally stood up to ungrateful children. I received hundreds of emails from other parents who shared similar stories of adult children who had become entitled and demanding. But there was also criticism, particularly from people who believed that family bonds should be unconditional and that parents should forgive their children no matter what. Some commenters called me cold, bitter, and vindictive. They argued that I had overreacted to a single bad conversation and that I would regret my decision when I was old and alone. The criticism stung, but it also strengthened my resolve. These critics were operating from the same assumption my children had made, that parents owed their children unlimited forgiveness and support, regardless of how they were treated in return. I had learned the hard way that unconditional love could become a prison, trapping generous people in relationships with those who exploited their kindness. Setting boundaries wasn't cruel. It was necessary for self-preservation. One of the most meaningful responses I received came from a therapist who specialized in family dynamics. She wrote to tell me that my story was a perfect example of what she tried to teach her clients about healthy boundaries and the difference between love and enabling. Too many parents confuse love with martyrdom, she wrote. They think that suffering for their children proves how much they care, when in reality, it often prevents their children from learning to be responsible and appreciative. Your decision to stop enabling your children's sense of entitlement was an act of self-respect, not selfishness. Her words helped me articulate something I had been feeling, but hadn't been able to express. I hadn't stopped loving my children when I cut them out of my life. I had simply stopped allowing my love for them to destroy my love for myself. As winter approached, I heard through Margaret that my children were struggling more than they had expected. Tyler had been evicted from his apartment and was living with friends, moving from couch to couch every few weeks. Cassie had been passed over for a promotion at work and was having financial difficulties. Marcus had been forced to sell his condo and move to a cheaper apartment when he couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. Part of me felt a flicker of sympathy for their struggles. The mother in me wanted to reach out, to offer help, to make their problems go away. But I reminded myself that these were the same people who had told me I was a burden, who had refused to help me when they thought I was facing foreclosure, who had said the world would be better off if I were dead. Their current difficulties were not my responsibility. They were adults who had made their own choices, and they could deal with the consequences of those choices without my intervention. Margaret, who continued to serve as my unofficial informant about my children's activities, told me that they had tried several different strategies to force me back into their lives. They had contacted distant relatives, asking them to intervene on their behalf. They had showed up at my volunteer locations, hoping to corner me in public. They had even hired a private investigator to try to find evidence that I was mentally incompetent. All of their efforts had failed. The relatives they contacted either supported my decision or refused to get involved. The organizations where I volunteered had security policies in place to protect their volunteers from harassment. And the private investigator had found nothing but evidence of my mental competence and active community involvement. My children had assumed that cutting me out of their lives would give them power over me, that I would eventually come crawling back, desperate for their forgiveness. Instead, they had discovered that I was perfectly capable of living without them, while they were struggling to navigate adulthood without the safety net they had always taken for granted. The first anniversary of our family dinner approached in November, and I decided to mark the occasion with a celebration. Not a celebration of the pain I had experienced, but a celebration of the strength I had discovered and the new life I had built. I invited Margaret, Robert, Linda, and several of my new friends from my volunteer work to join me for dinner at my favorite restaurant. As we sat around the table, laughing and sharing stories, I marveled at how different this gathering felt from that terrible dinner a year ago. These people cared about me as a person, not as a source of financial support or emotional labor. They were interested in my thoughts, my feelings, my experiences. They asked about my volunteer work, my relationship with Robert, my plans for the future. They treated me with respect and affection, and they expected nothing from me except friendship. This, I realized, was what healthy relationships looked like. This was what I had been missing during all those years of one-sided giving to my children. As the evening wound down and my friends began to leave, Robert lingered behind to walk me to my car. "You know," he said as we strolled through the restaurant's parking lot, "I hope you realize how remarkable this past year has been for you. You've completely transformed your life." I considered his words as we reached my car. He was right. A year ago, I had been a woman trapped in toxic relationships with people who saw me only as a source of support and convenience. I had been anxious, depressed, and desperately trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. Now I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was. I was engaged in meaningful work that made a difference in other people's lives. I was in a relationship with a man who respected and appreciated me. I was financially secure and emotionally free. "You're right," I told Robert. "It has been remarkable. And you know what the most remarkable part is?" "What's that?" I smiled as I thought about the answer. "The most remarkable part is that it all started when 3 people told me that the world would be better off if I were dead. They thought they were destroying me, but they actually saved me." Robert took my hand and squeezed it gently. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to us turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. As I drove home that night, I thought about the woman I had been a year ago and the woman I had become. The old Lorene had been so focused on being needed that she had forgotten to consider whether she was valued. She had confused being useful with being loved, and she had sacrificed her own well-being in the pursuit of approval from people who were incapable of appreciating her sacrifices. The new Lorene understood the difference between love and exploitation, between generosity and enabling, between family and people who happened to share her DNA. She had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop rescuing them from the consequences of their own choices. She had also learned that it was never too late to start over, to build new relationships, to discover new purposes, to create a life that brought joy instead of stress. As I pulled into my driveway and looked at my house with its new security system and changed locks, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was my sanctuary now, a place where only people who respected and valued me were welcome. My children had told me that the world would be better off if I were dead, but they had been wrong about that, just as they had been wrong about so many other things. The world wasn't better off without me in it. But my world was definitely better off without them in it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.